Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. It's wild when you really think about it. Your brain only makes up about 2% of your total body weight, but it completely hogs around 20% of your body's energy. It is an absolute metabolic powerhouse. But as it turns out, it's also incredibly picky about the type of fuel you give it. Today, we're going to unpack a truly fascinating yet often hidden connection that affects every single one of us. We're talking about the direct, immediate link between what we eat and how we think. If you've ever wondered why deep focus sometimes feels just effortlessly easy, while on other days it feels like you're trying to wade through wet cement, well, the answer might actually be sitting right in your pantry. We're going to explore what's called the Nutritional Blueprint, diving deep into the science and educational materials to map out exactly how highly processed foods impact our cognitive and emotional balance. All right, let's jump straight into part 1, the block tower breakdown, a real-life scenario. So why do simple tasks sometimes end in sudden frustration? It's a phenomenon we see in kids literally all the time, but frankly, we adults definitely aren't immune to it either. The source materials present us with a really relatable story to illustrate just how vulnerable our focus is. Picture a child happily sitting on the floor, enthusiastically trying to build this tall tower out of blocks, or maybe they're just quietly reading a new book. It's a simple, everyday task. It only requires mild concentration, but then, seemingly out of nowhere, the mood completely shatters. The kid becomes easily frustrated. Their attention span completely evaporates, and suddenly blocks are flying across the room. Now, as adults, we might just aggressively close the spreadsheet instead of throwing toys, but the underlying mechanism is exactly the same. So what just happened? Well, it wasn't the complexity of the blocks, and it certainly wasn't the book.
The hidden culprit isn't necessarily a bad night's sleep or a totally random mood swing. The materials point directly to what happened maybe just 5 minutes prior: the ingestion of an ultra-processed sugary snack. That sudden inability to focus or handle mild adversity, it wasn't random at all. It was a direct, immediate biological response. See, when we consume foods with a massive glycemic index, our bodies absorb those sugars incredibly fast. This spikes our blood glucose and instantly derails our executive function. So that behavioral breakdown we just talked about, that's really just the outward symptom of an inward chemical chaos.
Moving on to Section 2, Inside the Jittery Brain, or the mechanics of a sugar rush.
Okay, so when we eat these highly processed sugary foods, we're basically setting off this rapid biological chain reaction. Step 1 is the ingestion itself. Boom! A massive dump of dopamine and glucose hits the bloodstream. Step 2 is that initial sugar rush hitting the system. Now, it feels like energy, right? But it's actually just an unsustainable metabolic spike. And then comes Step 3, which is where the real cognitive impact happens. Your brain doesn't get energized in a productive, focused way. Instead, it enters this highly jittery state. Neurons are firing, sure, but the signal-to-noise ratio is completely thrown off. It becomes a state of sharply increased physical and mental restlessness. Imagine trying to run a marathon while sitting in a desk chair. That physical agitation makes it nearly impossible for the brain's frontal lobe to just sit still, regulate impulses, and concentrate on the task at hand.
In fact, the educational materials give us this exact quote: "Processed foods can make it hard to think and feel calm." And honestly, that just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly sums up the science. It highlights a profound truth. The physical restlessness generated by our diet directly attacks and dismantles our mental calm. You simply cannot separate the physical input from the cognitive output. When your nervous system is in overdrive from a glucose spike, trying to force a state of mental tranquility is basically fighting a losing biological battle.
Which brings us to Section 3, the fog and the crash, or what happens when the rush finally ends.
And this introduces a really critical concept known as cognitive fog. This is a mental state triggered by heavily processed foods where the brain essentially loses its clarity, resulting in severely reduced concentration. Because let's face it, a sugar rush never lasts. Actually, scratch that, it doesn't just fade, it actively crashes. Once insulin rushes in to sweep all that excess glucose out of the bloodstream, your brain is suddenly starved of the very fuel it was just flooded with. It transitions from bouncing around in a jittery panic straight into becoming clouded, sluggish, and totally bogged down. In this state, completing a daily task isn't just frustrating, the brain physiologically lacks the clear processing power to actually get it done.
Let's actually trace how that whole sequence plays out on a timeline. Point 1, right at the start, is that initial rush, a sudden spike in perceived energy. But then, midway through at point 2, that jitteriness morphs into cognitive fog as the body scrambles to regulate the incoming sugar. And then comes point 3, the drop. Now, this isn't just physical exhaustion. It is a profound emotional crash. The source material emphasizes that this is the moment where a person goes from simply being tired to feeling grumpy, sad, or deeply restless. The sharp drop in blood sugar can actually mimic the physiological symptoms of anxiety, tricking the brain into a state of emotional instability. So the diet hasn't just drained their physical energy, it's actively destabilized their mood. But listen, it is absolutely crucial that we don't just write this off as some isolated, temporary mood swing over a dropped block or a really annoying email. The research presented in our sources points to some pretty serious, compounding long-term risks to our mental well-being. Frequent sugar crashes cause ongoing emotional instability. When your brain is constantly riding this chemical roller coaster, it can lead to chronic neuroinflammation. And most alarmingly, the materials document a clear link showing that diets heavy in sugar actively increase the risk of depressive moods. This isn't just about a bad Tuesday afternoon. It's a consistent, compounding negative influence on a person's overall physical and mental well-being over time.
So what do we do about it? Let's look at Section 4, Fueling Focus and Calm, the Nutritional Blueprint. Basically, we're looking at a pretty stark choice in how we fuel our bodies and, by extension, our minds. On the one hand, we can accept the default path of a highly processed diet, which brings with it reduced concentration, emotional instability, and increased restlessness. Or we can consciously choose the goals of the nutritional blueprint: a calm mind, a focused mind, and true emotional regulation. The core takeaway from these educational resources is that our cognitive baseline is completely malleable. By supplying the brain with steady, slow-burning fuel, think complex carbohydrates, proteins, and healthy fats that stabilize that glucose curve, we can actually choose the outcomes of focus and calm over the symptoms of fog and panic.
The source text used this great heading, Brain Power, keep it clear with good choices. And you know, that isn't just some catchy slogan. It's a highly actionable philosophy. It means recognizing that every single meal is an opportunity to literally fuel your brain's processing power. It's an empowering call to action for students, professionals, and parents alike to implement practical steps like swapping simple sugars for fiber-rich foods that naturally slow down digestion so we can protect our executive function and maintain that vital, clear-headed focus throughout the whole day.
Which really leaves us with this final vital thought to ponder. As the science and the source materials clearly demonstrate, our dietary choices are just inextricably linked to our cognitive resilience. What we eat directly dictates our ability to complete daily tasks and regulate our emotions in the face of stress. So, I want you to ask yourself right now, how will your next meal dictate your ability to regulate your emotions today? Are you feeding the fog, or are you fueling the focus? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this blueprint helps you make your next choice a great one.